Greetings, fellow philosophers. This brief presentation wants to orientate you towards the reading, give you some additional background information that help prepare you for what you're going to be. Before we do that, though, just want to briefly rehearse what we've read before. The first article we read was Meno, and the topic that we covered, the issue that we covered, because can virtue be taught? Remember how pessimistic Socrates was about whether or not we actually could teach virtue in the same way we could teach things. Next article was Plato's Republic, and a lot there, but what we did there was talk about the nature of human personality and the way that it's divided up into various parts. This appetitive part, this part that drives personality, that wants things, we will see in the coming weeks, and we'll actually see in the next article that we read that this can be somewhat problematic, that not all of our instincts are good, and we need to, and that's what we saw in the Nichomachean ethic, that there's this part, this irrationality that Aristotle talked about that needs to be brought under control by the dictates of reason. So complicated article that we read, but we just wanted to highlight a few of the things that are important for us. This idea of happiness as being the kind of thing that human beings strive for, and what oftentimes gets in the way is our own self and impulses that we don't bring under control. We talked about the golden mean as well, and how important that is for us in helping us proper moral decisions. We're not going to talk about it in this class very much, just briefly reference that both Plato and Aristotle were important classical thinkers in the development of Christian theology. Plato was an influence on Augustine, and Aristotle in Aquinas. We're not going to go into the detail of that, except to note that others have done the same thing that you've been doing in this course, and that is to read and be influenced by these classical thinkers. What is important for us to note historically is that John Locke wrote in what is oftentimes called the Age of Enlightenment, and you see from this graph, this line graph, where that particular historical era ends and begins. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, the readers that we've read so far, you can see how they fit in a timeline in comparison to where we are now. John Locke is right at the very beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, and the time when the world began, the intellectual world began to think differently about life. It was a time when individuals began to question and doubt and wonder about whether or not we should continue to listen to the authorities, especially the religious authorities in life, and accept revelation as a foundation for truth, and whether or not we should think differently. And you'll see some material about the Enlightenment in the readings for this week, but this does mark a transition into how we think, and Locke is at the very forefront of this. Sometimes he's called the father of liberalism. By that we don't mean the political liberalism that we think about today, not a liberal political person, but liberal in the sense that believed in the power of the mind and the power of reason and the power of investigation to be able to guide. We've talked about these major categories: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. And we talked about the difference between idealism and realism and the way that they look at these particular categories. So the realists, which Locke is aligned with, look at reality as objective and fixed and something external to the mind, something that we actually can know independent of any prior mental constructs we might have. And so he fits very nicely in with Aristotle. So if you want to think conceptually about where we are going, the idealists, people who think that truth is in our minds, and we can discover those through dialogue and contemplation. Are on one side Aristotle, Locke. How do we know what is true? Well, this goes along with our metaphysics. We know things are true in an Aristotelian and Lockean kind of way by investing in the very real world. And probably the very most important thing for our consideration about Locke is the idea of how important rationality is, and thinking things through, and thinking logically, and following the dictates of reason. And we'll see that in the reading this week, that it's important for us to be able to develop our thoughts rationally. And how do we are good? Well, we follow the dictates of reason, and we'll see also that there's other things that can help us become good. And we'll talk about how important praise and shame is. There's a term that you probably might have heard before, this idea of tabula rasa, the notion that our minds are a blank slate, and everything that we know, everything that we understand about life comes from our experiences. There's nothing that's formed ahead in our brains before we were born. And that's a very important idea for Locke in two ways. One, it really does form the foundation of what he thinks about the importance of experiences and having something that fills the mind, and then the importance of taking those ideas and forming of the American Revolution, because he formed the foundation for what a lot of the individuals who were writing and thinking at the time of the revolution stories of them. So what is there to discover? Well, what is there to discover is that if we think clearly about the life that we see in front of us, we will discover that there are natural laws that can be observed, and those laws are written not so much in a book, but in what some people call the book of nature, that you see in the world around us, laws, principles. And Locke then did become an important thought about the world we live in. And you can most clearly see Locke's influence on the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's famous words that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is almost a direct quote from John Locke. And this idea that the foundation for what the colonies were going to do is the self-evident laws that exist in the world that can be discovered by being observant of them. So we saw, again, just repeating what we said earlier about the tabula rasa, that we don't know any of this intuitively, but all these truths are discovered as we live life and are observant about the circumstances around us. So why did Locke write this book? Well, he wrote it because he knew how important it was for people to be able to think clearly in order to be participants in democracy. So everything we've said up to now is basically the foundation for the book that we're going to be reading, and how important it is for us to develop citizens who can participate in democracy. And what will make for democracy, what will make for self-government, are thinking people who've been educated properly. So with that, that's a little bit of a brief introduction to what you'll be reading. And then at the end of your answering questions, I'll come up with a brief summary.